Have you ever looked at a complex piece of metal, like an engine block or even just a simple frying pan, and wondered, how on earth did they make that? Well, today, we're diving into one of the most ancient and important manufacturing processes out there, metal casting. We're going to go from literal sand to the intricate metal shapes that really build our entire world.
And I mean ancient. Just let that sink in for a minute. 6,000 years. You know, from the earliest arrowheads all the way to the parts inside your car, the fundamental idea has barely changed. So this isn't some dusty old history lesson. It's a living, breathing technology that's behind, well, almost everything. And at its core, the whole thing is just beautifully simple. This quote really nails it. Melt the metal, pour it in a mold, and let it freeze. Honestly, if you've ever made Jell-O, you get the basic concept. You take a liquid, you pour it into a mold, and you wait for it to get solid. We're just swapping out the gelatin for some seriously hot molten metal.
So to really wrap our heads around this, here's how we're going to break it down. We'll start with that core concept, melt, pour, freeze. Then we'll look at the key ingredients. After that, we'll get into the real secret sauce, designing the perfect pattern. Then we'll walk through how the sand mold is built, and finally, we'll see the big transformation from liquid metal to a solid part.
Okay, so why even bother with all this? Why do we do this? Well, casting is pretty much the best way to make really complex metal shapes. You know, things that would be super difficult, crazy expensive, or maybe even impossible to carve out of a solid chunk of metal. So, let's get just a little more specific for a second. The official definition gives us the key words we need to know. You've got the liquid material, which is our molten metal. You've got the mold, which is basically the container. And then you have the cavity. That's the empty space inside the mold. And that is the key takeaway here. The shape of that empty space becomes the shape of your final object. Simple as that.
All right, so what do we need to pull this off? Well, for sand casting, which is the most common kind, it really just comes down to three main things. The sand itself, the box that holds the sand, that's the mold, and the thing we use to make the shape in the sand, and that's called the pattern. Now hold on, this is not the kind of sand you find at the beach. Oh no. Foundry sand is actually a pretty high-tech material. It has to have strength, right, so it doesn't just collapse when you pour molten metal into it. It needs to be permeable, which is a fancy way of saying gases can escape through the sand. If they can't, you get bubbles in your casting. And this is a cool one. It has to be collapsible, so it gives way just a tiny bit as the metal cools and shrinks. That stops the brand new part from cracking under its own stress.
So we pack all this special sand into a box, or what's called a flask, and it actually comes in two halves. The bottom part is called the drag, and the top part is the cope. The easiest way to think about it is like the top and bottom of a hamburger bun. They clamp together to hold everything inside.
So how do we make that all-important cavity? Well, that's where the pattern comes in. The pattern is pretty much a replica of the object we're trying to make. You press it into the sand, pull it out, and it leaves behind a perfect impression. And the source material is really clear on this one. You simply cannot get a good casting without a good pattern. It is that crucial.
Okay, so we've got our sand, we've got our pattern, but here, this is where the real magic of casting happens. You'd think the pattern is an exact one-to-one copy of the final part, right? But it's not. It's actually cleverly changed to work with the laws of physics. And these little changes are called allowances. This is the secret sauce.
And this right here is the big aha moment of this whole process. See, metal isn't static. As it cools down from this incredibly hot liquid into a solid, it shrinks, it can warp, it basically fights back. A good pattern designer knows this is going to happen, and they build the solutions right into the pattern from the very beginning. It's like they're predicting the future.
So the biggest, most important allowance is for shrinkage. Every metal shrinks as it cools down, so the pattern has to be made a little bit bigger than the final object you want. They even use a special ruler called a shrink rule that's just proportionally longer than a normal ruler, so it automatically builds in that extra size. How smart is that?
Next up, you've got what's called a draft allowance. Imagine trying to get a perfectly square cake out of a cake pan without messing up the edges. It's tough. It's the same idea here. By adding a tiny taper to the sides of the pattern, that's the draft, it slides out of the sand super cleanly, leaving that perfect cavity behind. It's a small detail that makes all the difference.
Okay, this one is probably my favorite. It's just so clever. So some shapes, especially long U-shapes, have a tendency to warp as they cool. The ends pull inwards. So what do? You actually make the pattern bent the wrong way on purpose. That way, when the real part cools down and distorts, it actually pulls itself into the perfect straight shape.
It's like you're tricking physics into doing the work for you. Just brilliant. All right, so we've got our super smart sand and our cleverly designed pattern. Now it's time for the main event, putting it all together to build the mold. This is where things really start to take shape, literally. Now, the full-on industrial process has something like 15 different steps, but we can boil it down to the big four. First, you pack sand into the bottom half, the drag, around your pattern. Then, you flip it over, put the top half, the cope on, and pack that with sand. Third, you have to create all the plumbing. You know, little channels for the metal to flow in and vents for the gases to get out. And finally, you pull the two halves apart and carefully lift the pattern out, leaving that beautiful, empty cavity behind.
And this is what that actually looks like. Over on the left, you can see the first half of the pattern sitting in the drag, which is packed with sand. Then on the right, you can see the cope being placed on top, ready to be filled up to form the other half of the mold. So our mold is completely assembled and ready to go. And that brings us to the most dramatic part of the whole story, the pour. This is that moment where all that prep work pays off and we actually create a solid metal object.
But wait, before we pour, there's one last hero we need to talk about, the riser. Remember how metal shrinks when it cools? Well, if a thick part of the casting cools too slowly, it can create an empty spot, or a void, right in the middle. The riser is basically an extra tank of molten metal that keeps feeding liquid into the main casting as it shrinks, making sure everything stays solid and completely filled. It's a total game changer.
And here it is. This diagram really brings the whole puzzle together. You can see the cope and the drag making the outside box. You've got the cavity for the part, you've even got a core, which is just a piece of sand used to make a hole in the final part. And right there, connected to everything, is our hero, the riser, just waiting to do its job. The whole system is perfectly designed for that one fiery moment.
And then, it happens. The molten metal is poured in, it rushes through all those channels, fills up the cavity, and starts to cool from the outside in. Once it's solid, the sand mold is just broken away, and inside is the brand new metal casting. The sand, of course, can be collected and used all over again.
So there you have it. From that incredibly simple idea, melt, pour, freeze, we create these amazingly complex and vital parts that we rely on every single day. This 6,000-year-old process is hiding in plain sight, all around us. So it kind of makes you wonder, right? Just look around you. What objects do you see that started their life as nothing more than hot liquid metal in a humble mold made of sand?